So thank you everyone for sticking with us. I know virtual events can sometimes be tiring after a while, but we do have an exciting session on server-side GTM in 2022 coming up right now. So I'd like to introduce Ben Fisher. Ben is a product manager at Google and is passionate about the evolution of tagging, web analytics, and a healthier, privacy-centric internet. Also joining Ben is our own Tyler Blatt. Tyler is a lead analytics engineer at InfoTrust and a Google Cloud certified cloud architect, as you can see by his awesome sweatshirt badge. So take it away, Ben and Tyler.
Awesome. Thank you very much for the intro, Chase.
Thanks, Chase.
Go ahead, Ben. Sorry. Yeah, so today we'll be diving into just an overview of server-side GTM. And really the goal is going to be, I know, in the CPG space, but really all around the world, there's a lot of confusion around when do we go to server side? What kind of problems is it solving? What's the real value proposition? There's just a lot of unknowns on what it is. And that's what we're hoping to dive into today. And hopefully you come out of this session knowing start of next year, what are my plans? How can I get involved? What's the best way that I could be utilizing these services in 2022? So it's a short session with a lot of info packed into it. So we're going to dive in and I'm going to go over the agenda real quick on what you can expect to get out of this. So first, Ben and I are going to discuss what is server-side tag management. So just from the concept, if you're not even familiar with what's really happening, we'll go over what is server-side tag management, followed by pain points of the traditional tag management system. So client-side tag management systems have some problems, and that's why the rise of server-side and the popularity has been so relevant recently. Then once we've identified those client-side problems, we'll address how is server-side actually addressing them? How can we expect server-side to squelch those problems we're going through? We'll go through a brief overview of what server-side GTM is going to look like. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit on what you need to get started with server-side GTM so you can kind of understand the investment. So with that, we'll jump into the section where we explain a little bit about like what is server-side tag management. We can go to the next slide. So for this first slide, I think it's important when we're talking about what is server-side tag management to understand exactly how client-side tag management works. Essentially, what you're doing on with client-side tag management is you're downloading a GTM container to your website. What that means is you're using JavaScript code to reach out and actually load a GTM container on your website. And what that GTM container is going to do is load other third-party JavaScript libraries to your website as well. So you actually are running all of this code on your site, and then that code needs to make requests out to third-party APIs from your site. So not only are you loading more JavaScript code, but it's also sending data out to those third-party client libraries.
Yeah, that's how I said. So using a tag manager is still more efficient than placing these tags directly on your site, but each third-party script is loading directly, even if through the GTM container.
Exactly. We can go to the next slide. And so where this gets interesting, and this is specifically a problem that I see a lot of CPGs companies facing, is how do we deal with that at scale? Because in reality, we want to have uniform tracking. We want to be able to track, if we have 100 plus sites and we want to be able to report on them in the same way or be able to collect data in the same way, how do we manage the standardization of those containers and that JavaScript and all of that loading and all of the rules and logic that comes to collecting that data across all of these sites when we have to individually load this code on each site where we know sites may behave differently? There are two techniques that I should say are being used in the space that I see a lot. One is a global container. So you decide all the data that you're going to collect comes from your data layer on the individual site basis, and that data layer will configure where it's going to send the data. But the mechanism or instructions for collecting data from GTM remain completely standardized globally. They're all the same across all sites. And then some sites will employ a local container process where they'll use clever APIs and mass functionality to try to enforce the same rules across many different containers and enforce standardization at scale that way. Both are, and I've actually seen some companies doing both of those. They have a global standard and they try to keep a local standard as well to give a little bit more leeway. But you need a lot of processing and a lot of industry knowledge to be able to achieve uniform scaling on the client side for data collection. We can go to the next slide. And so with that, we jump into the server side example and how it's different. So with server side, if we need to consolidate and go at scale, you could actually you could employ similar techniques, but what's beautiful is you can actually manage the standardization of those within your server side containers. So you could point the event stream of two websites through your server side container, and you can actually store off your event stream in BigQuery as well. One really big piece of information to call out here is this server side code or the client side JavaScript, all those libraries and all the things that we were loading on the website. Some still will need to load and configure IDs, but for the large majority of your measurement, that code doesn't need to run on the website anymore. So we've moved all of that processing and that requesting off into the server-side container, which is going to have big impacts on your page.
Yeah, that's a really important point Tyler made right there. There's a difference between server-side tagging and other server-to-server forms of measurement. And I think in the industry, there's a lot of confusion as to what is server-side tagging versus what is a server-to-server approach or an S2S API and things like that. So when talking about server-side tagging here, the way that Google recommends customers use server-side tagging is what we call a hybrid approach, which, as Tyler said, means you're able to drastically consolidate the amount of JavaScript on your site and rely on a single or a couple of tags in each of your site to handle the data collection for all of your measurement tools. And then, as Tyler mentioned, you send that to server containers. It can be from multiple websites, and that's where you have all the control to do things with the data, fan it out, and manage it in one environment. So hybrid approach is the key thing to take away from kind of this mechanism. As you see, you still have the line going from the website to the server container. You can't magically collect that data without having some tags on site, but that's the approach we take.
Perfect. And with that, I think we're ready to jump into what are the pain points that we're solving from traditional TMS. From this section, we're going to try to identify what are the things that are coming up that are making server-side so interesting.
Yeah, and a quick thing, there are a bunch of like pain points we are directly trying to tackle with server-side GTM, but also it's one of Google's main levers we are using to help future-proof advertisers measurement. So like one of the beauties of it that we won't touch on here really, because it's not a direct pain point today, but how do we make sure that as the privacy and regulatory landscape evolves, you are able to quickly adapt to it as an advertiser, right? And we allow you to take advantage of new privacy-centric features that we roll out and adjust to the kind of constrictions in terms of what data you can collect and the policies you have to ensure and things like that. So it's not just like a standalone platform today. It's also a way of us making sure that you are prepped for the next couple of years of privacy craziness.
Yep, we absolutely see it as a long-term strategy position to at InfoTrust. So when I can, I'll touch on those points as much as I can here as we go through some of these pain points that we'll go through. This one, I won't stay on as long, but one of the things that's essentially difficult on client side, and I've already touched on, is figuring out how do we manage that scale. So we've already talked about that a little bit. You also have the concepts of is your data layer standard. So you don't really see what's going on the client side. There's JavaScript that's running and triggering tags and passing data off. But when you have that event stream coming into your controlled environment in the cloud, you then can monitor that event stream and understand which sides are collecting things that aren't standard to that event stream. You actually can be the watcher on the wall, kind of understand what's going on. So one of the things is managing a standard data layer is very difficult on the client side. Managing the tags firing the same way, and then a real big one is compliance. So understanding, what data am I collecting and where. It's a little bit harder to see what's going on. It just seems like a place that there's not a lot of visibility. So another huge piece, and I touched on it a little bit on that last side, is the security and governance of all the data that you're collecting on client-side tag management systems can be just a nightmare for companies to try to track down. Essentially, tags are configured to fire other tags, to fire other tags. You don't know what tags are firing what. JavaScript can be difficult to track down as far as what it's doing. And then if you have a leak or the PII is sent somewhere, but that tag piggybacked off another tag, and that PII was sent to multiple places, and you need to be able to get there and delete it. Managing the security risks of JavaScript being able to piggyback and the governance of what you're collecting, where you should be sending it, and what's happening becomes very, very difficult with traditional TMS.
Yeah, that's a big selling point for our advertisers is they want to avoid data leakage scenarios. And although there are a lot of things in client-side GTM that allow you to ensure that tags aren't collecting or accessing things in the page they shouldn't be, such as policies and things you can do with sandbox JavaScript, right? At the end of the day, the fewer third-party tags you need to run on your site, the better. The easier it is to manage those kinds of policies, and you don't have to write them around all the tags. You just know there's one tag doing something on my site, and the rest of it is controlled in a secure server environment where I determine exactly what each third-party platform should see. Also, really quickly, I want to check in that the full slide is showing Chase. On Iris screen, it looks like it might not be. You good?
Yeah, I believe it's good. I've got the live stream on.
Yeah, you guys are good.
Thanks.
So speaking of moving JavaScript off the page for security reasons, it also has site speed reasons. So the more that we're moving things off, and not only is it just better for leakage and general governance, but it's better for site speed. Each individual tag actually has to be loaded on client side, like we talked about. It actually gets downloaded in, and then it's also making requests out. It's important to understand too, tags are very light. They're easy to load, but on individual computers, each individual device, there's a limited number of TCP IP connections. I know most of you aren't engineers and you're like, Tyler just said a bunch of letters. But what that means is you can think of you have like 4 highways, 8 highways, 16 highways to load data in. And if everybody's trying to use those highways, that's all you have. So even if they're fast, you're waiting on them all to take turns loading those things out. As you limit those, the resources will load much faster. And when we're talking about less populated areas of the world, cell phone connections, the performance you're going to get in markets where internet is much more of a valuable commodity, it'll drastically increase your abilities there. And I'll talk a little bit more of the values of that later. But it's definitely going to increase your site speed performance. We can jump into the next one. And this is, so if you were sitting there thinking, yeah, but how bad is the JavaScript on my website? How many piggybacking tags? This is actually, I've cropped out what client this is from, but this is a live client's website. And this is only the top half of the image. I zoomed in a little bit, and there's a whole bottom half of this image of tags piggybacking off of tags. All of these are loading on all page views. So when we talk about those highways getting blocked up, we talk about knowing where we're sending data. We talk about governing all of this, understanding the data layer rules to send all of this. It becomes such a wide thing to measure and to understand where my data is ending up, where it's going. And this is more of a shock slide just to show this is how complicated this can get. I'll go through this one very quickly, but this one's in here for, I should state the reason. I think everybody probably is aware of what a third-party cookie is, and if at this point you aren't, essentially the functionality, I'm not going to read through the slide as much as to say, this is how, through some clever redirecting change, that third-party advertisers have been able to share their IDs and personally target users. So you can say, I want to target to this person. This is how they've been able to identify users, and this technology is being deprecated. The reason that I bring this up is a lot of the client-side tags that you're loading rely on this. And when we talk about long-term activation strategy, and as Ben stated, Google's ability to provide you with the ability to use tools that come out, own your own first-party data, and be agile in your advertising stack in the most compliant way, it's important to understand that you are losing something with the current state of client side, and GTM, while it might not completely fix the problem, fill that hole, it is positioning you to be agile in that space so that you can find the solutions for it. Another interesting one that I see with people a lot is they get upset where we're like, hey, we have our transactions loading on the back end, and we know we had 80% transactions, and we think what's happening is we actually have JavaScript blockers that are missing. We've checked this up, and the thing is, because it's loading on a customer's computer, JavaScript can be blocked. it can be stopped. That there's plugins to do this. There's Chrome plugins. There's softwares that say, hey, anything that's not part of this core website's library, don't load it. I don't want to load anything else. Like I don't want any of these other trackings. And there's really nothing you can do about it. Now, I should say, if we're talking about getting around JavaScript blockers, it is very important to be compliant. I'm not saying that, hey, we should just collect it whether they want to or not. But I am saying if you've done everything to be compliant and you've gotten the proper access, it can be a pain to have JavaScript blockers just stopping everything that you're trying to collect.
Yeah, that's how I alluded to. Like the point is that we're helping you consolidate your measurement around kind of first party measurement as much as we can, meaning you own where the scripts are loaded from, you own where the data goes to prior to being sent to other places. You set more of the cookies yourself as opposed to these third-party tags doing it and things like that. So that gives you more control, both as like the browsers and regulations evolve, but also as we roll out new things, we can give you tools to help you do that.
Exactly. And then we got one more as far as the pain points. Then we're going to jump into the exciting stuff of how GTM's solving it, which, you know, Ben and I can't help but talk about it a little bit already. Essentially, your data is going all over the place. When you're collecting data from the client side, all of the data that's being collected exists in one place at one time. It's all sitting there, and you're distributing it to a bunch of other platforms. You're saying, I want to send this piece over here, this piece over here. And you really don't own a lot of it for yourself as much as you're sending it out in a lot of places. So there's often, and this will lead into the value proposition, spoiler alert, of owning your own first party data sets. But a problem that I hear from a lot of people is like, I just need access to my data now. And I have to wait on processing times here, and there's no ID to link to this one and figuring these pieces out. And so having that distributed data is a core problem you see a lot with client side because you just don't own that raw data set. All right, so how does GTM solve these problems, or server-side GTM, that is? We'll try to, we have two more sections of slides, so I'm going to try to go quicker through this one, but please feel free as we go through this, drop questions in the chat, and if you feel like you want to know anything more, we'd love to be engaged in this, so we're never afraid to get involved. So I can touch for this one like really quickly. It's not too complicated to understand, and especially since time's tight, I'll just touch on this. Everything in the red box where we showed tags loading on your web, that's all client side. So when I talked about those TCP/IP connections, or like, you know, like where internet is a more of a scarce commodity, you're fighting for internet for all those. And that big scary image I showed with all those tags piggybacking, that's a nightmare in those scenarios. Where everything in the red box on the right side for your client side is client side, and everything else happens server side. Now, while you might have to fire one Google Analytics tag, one Google Ads tag locally to get IDs, the measurement is minimized, which means you're going to increase your SEO scores and your general site performance, which studies have shown increase essentially your KPIs. Okay, this is another big one, and then I think one of the core value propositions to server side is just the mess of security and governance around client side, and how it sort of is trivialized with server side. You control the black box in which you are collecting data and where you're sending it. It's no longer a thing where the client can interfere, softwares can interfere. So there's so many rules and a mess of logic to navigating that web, or those images I've been showing of tags piggybacking off of tags. Another big piece, this links a little bit back to the site C performance, is because you're processing and using that the network that way, it's very expensive on the client's performance. You're paying for that in client performance. So moving it to the cloud, you can have a little bit easier environment where it's cheaper to pay for that performance. So you're getting better value. Consoling your pipeline to an event stream means you can monitor that event stream and know exactly the standardization of what data you're collecting. So if you're missing user ID, it's going to become very obvious to you because your event stream's coming in and you control the box that it's coming into. If you're missing certain pieces, governing the data and the strategy is all coming into one single box that you can have the logic put on to understand what's happening and how to react to it. Versus when things go missing on the client side, you have to wait for it to go into an API downstream, and then all of a sudden things aren't showing up, and this floodlight didn't collect data, and now the advertising's over. It's a nightmare, versus you can actually see it coming in and solve the problems as it comes in. This is a weird one. And it depends on if you need IDs for the platform. But if you have a platform that you don't need to do a handshake for an ID on an individual user, you also can own your own raw data set, and you can potentially replay some data into that platform if the platform supports it. So that's another piece where if you own your event data historically, you have the ability to kind of replay it in any direction that you want to. Though this would take a little bit of software, but it is allowing you to solve that problem long term.
Yeah, and the consolidating data stream one is really important for data governance. Like think traditionally when you want to update what data you send to a certain third-party platform, you have to update the tag and then redeploy the tag, and you're actually making changes to your page. Whereas in server-side GTM, you configure that one event stream once from your client side, and then you send it to your server container, and you can more dynamically adjust what data should be exposed to what tags, then sent to what platforms without doing any redeployment of your client-side container. So less management, less interference, and much more control.
Perfect. This is a really interesting one as well. You're no longer injecting. This is a bit of a misnomer. You are still injecting some JavaScript, but you're not injecting as much JavaScript to the page. So from that perspective, it's a little bit easier to alter your measurement downstream without actually having to inject code to the website. Now, I'm not saying that on the week before Black Friday, you should be messing with your measurement containers. But what I will say is if you have measurement downstream that doesn't need JavaScript on page, it's a little bit safer to alter your measurement strategy closer to the holiday period when you're doing it in a web container that doesn't affect the website at all, versus potentially bringing down website functionality before a large holiday period. So I think the potential decoupling of measurement down the road, and the further it goes that way, lends yourself to be a little bit more agile in stressful periods. So you can test some new measurement or get out some new tags or new functionality in a time where no one's touching the website.
That's a terrific point, and also it means that you can iterate more quickly because you don't need as much IT and engineering collaboration to actually update your measurement.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's one that's been a little slept on in the community, but that is a very strong value proposition, especially very topical. In a month, everyone's going to be thinking, I got to get this tag out. What do I do? And yeah, that's something that if you're able to iterate more quickly in a little bit more safe of environment, I think that's a pretty big value proposition.
It's a great point, Tyler.
So we touched on this one quite a bit, and I highlighted in here as well. It's important to still be durable and compliant with your strategies that you're coming in. So with your ability to store everything, maybe not store everything and make sure that you should be compliant in what you're storing. However, as long as you're following a compliant strategy, there's no reason when your event streams are flowing through this server-side container that you don't just drop all your data into BigQuery. If you think about what analytics data is, and we talked about GA4 quite a bit today. When you think about even though the GA4 model is essentially what is everything on a website? Well, it's essentially a user interacting with your website with some sort of identity graph tied to it and other metadata. So it's a user doing something and then some other pieces of information on that person. And if all data is essentially built into this structure that can be applied then anywhere, why not store raw forms of that in BigQuery to where you can get action to it fast, and you can get the ability to own your own first-party data set long term. So this opens up quite a bit of options, and is what I think is a first step to a large first-party data storage strategy. Later come like CDPs and things like that, but this is a step in the right direction, getting you to where you can fully blow out an environment in your cloud where you own your data. This is an interesting one, and while maybe not the most important in the world, I do think it's one that solves a problem that some people are highly focused on in the industry. So when you're deploying a server-side GTM container, which we'll talk about later, but essentially anywhere that a Docker container can go, that allows you to put your own custom URL on it. When you put your own custom URL on it, I talked earlier when I was talking about JavaScript blocking. This doesn't get around JavaScript blocking necessarily, but for the way that it works, they will say, if it's not this URL or it's not this list of URLs, we have to load this because it could be website functionality. So one of the ways you can stop your tags from being essentially blocked is if in the example, and this is an image from Google's description of server-side tag manager, example.com is loading in this website container. What we actually can do is do data collection.example.com at example.com, and now there's no way to differentiate if this is core website functionality or if it's collecting things. So through your own ability to collect through the URL, you can circumvent people that are doing nefarious blocking. And I will say this again, even though I've said it a bunch, you still need to be compliant in what you're collecting. Don't just collect everything now because there's no rules and it's behind your URL. There absolutely still are rules, but this is a way to stop that style of blocking, or at least circumvent some of it.
Yeah, one of the other benefits of collecting your own URL is the ability to set cookies from your server, and it's hosted on your own domain, and this provides some increased durability to the longevity of cookies and things like that. So it's not meant as a means of circumventing browser policies, but it's one of the benefits of consolidating your measurement. So everything that's being loaded on the page, cookies being set, are all from your first-party domain. So that's a bit more technical, and then we have more documentation on that, but actually it does improve measurement durability immediately in some ways.
Yeah. And that I like the intention of when you have the kind of the client side problem and third party cookies as it goes down the piggyback chains, they're like, we don't know who's setting what and where it's coming from. Where when it's coming from your first party domain, your server side container, you're saying, we are setting this. We want this to be here. It's a bit more explicit and fits into the narrative of being compliant, but then still having a good durable stack.
Absolutely.
All right. This is a huge one. Most people have probably put this together at this point, but enriching data. So if we're getting the ID, if we're getting a Facebook ID, we're getting Google Client ID, we have Google Click ID, we have a nest of IDs or data that we've collected, and I'll say for the millionth time, in a compliant way. And we're consuming them into our container, we're setting that identity graph up for every hit. So if that identity graph's going up with every hit and you want to link Facebook ID to client ID, you can store Facebook ID in a custom dimension, or you can start finding ways to enhance the data, both going out to different server payloads. So where you're sending out to different third-party APIs, and then you also have that identity graph stored yourself for your own enhancement that you can link to a CRM or a CDP. So the ability to understand and map all of this data that's been consolidated to the places it's going opens up quite a lot of options for data enrichment.
Yeah, and there are ways that you can do this today, right? We have a native way to write to BigQuery, but we're also building a lot of cool functionality that helps you more easily pull data from your various data stores and filter, augment, redact, enrich, right? So Tyler focused on the enrichment piece. Like a classic example would be passing profit instead of revenue to some analytics tool. But there's also the value in being able to like augment this data prior to sharing it out with other tools. And a good example would be like if you look at some of the consent frameworks in the EU, they say that for unconsented hits, you can't share any personal information. And so you could use server-side GTM to redact or anonymize your IP address or make sure all the PII is scrubbed prior to sharing it. So it really gives you that more control, which will both make sure you're compliant, but also unlocks more insights you might have previously lost.
Amazing point. All right, we're getting a little bit closer to time, so I'll try to speed up through this, but a real quick example here. Time to insights, I think, is a really cool one. And I know there's one customer that is listening that's going to be interested in this. Every year, they stand up a holiday dashboard to project their revenue over the course of the day. And they are in the CPG space. It's a prediction engine that will project the revenue over the course of the day, and we have to run it through essentially third-party collection systems that we wait on their response. There's processing time to getting that data. Well, if it just drops in BigQuery in real time, we can access that data when it was collected. As it went through the GTM container, it was dropped in BigQuery, and we're ready to consume it. So anything where I need the insights now, I can do my own logic on it. I don't need to rely on it for figuring out, what marketing campaign it came, any kind of attribution models. I just want the raw data, some dashboard directly. You can use this as a really fast way to collect your data at speed. And with that, since we're on low time, I'm going to try to we'll go quick through these last bit of slides. They shouldn't take too long. The big thing that I want to show with server-side GTM, we're not going to go too far into the weeds because I know most of you probably aren't engineers, but I just want to show exactly what this title says. It's the same GTM new features. So when you go to stand up a server-side tag management container, it's no different than when you've done a web, iOS, Android, all AMP containers in the past. It's the same interface. You should be comfortable with it. It's just new features being added to this. There are some extra steps down the road to actually get it deployed, but from your interfacing and understanding how you're going to work with the tags, it should feel very much at home. They've done a great job with the UI here. Going over tags real quick, it isn't a huge list of feature tags, but they're definitely core to the use case. These are the tags that are currently supported by the platform. There's more tags to come, but for now, these are the tags that are currently supported by the platform. Mainly being Google Analytics tags, Floodlight tags, Google Ads tags. And then a really important one for you to notice at the bottom there is that HTTP request. You do have the ability to configure to go to places you need it to go. So you can work with the platform to figure out if there's something that's absolutely crucial that is not on this list or not on the list I'm about to show you after, which I'll show you what template tags are after, then you can figure out how to support it with that HTTP request.
Yeah, and really quickly, I know we're pretty much out of time, but people get scared off when they hear server anything and they think that it's very technical and hard to manage. But the point I want to make here is you are not learning a new skill. You already have people at your companies that use Google Tag Manager in many cases, and it's the familiar interface with many new benefits. So I think that's the point that Tyler and I really want to get across here.
For sure. Yeah, well summarized. And really quickly, if we can jump to the template tag page, and then we can, I'll go over that very quick, and then we'll jump to 2 slides forward to the just getting started. Then we can wrap up there. It should be very short. So what this is a template library created by other parties, where essentially they've used that functionality, which Ben might be able to explain a little better than I could. To create functionality for different APIs. So these aren't in that core library list, but these are templates that other parties have created saying, hey, we figured out how to do Facebook conversion API tag, use our template library, and you can just pull this tag in. Or you want to send Slack notifications when a certain error message comes through, someone's figured out a template library for that. So these are just libraries to help extend the functionality, and the community can help really build out tags very quickly using these templates.
Yeah, and just like a little snippet here. Facebook actually recommends server-side GTM as their de facto way of writing to their conversion API because it's so much simpler than writing to the API directly, and it's an easier way to manage it and control the data flow. So some traction in the market, and it'll continue to grow. It also means that if you have measurement partners that you don't see on this list that you want to add to it, they're able to, and we're able to work with them to do that.
Yep, and then we'll just read this last slide. We don't have to go too far into it, but just for an idea about how you're going to get started with this, essentially, you need a GCP project, or if you're not on GCP or don't want to use GCP, you just need an environment where you can deploy a Docker image. If you plan to add a domain name to it, you'll need the network IT team to buy in and work with you to essentially set up the AA records and point, DNS to your server. A budget for hosting, which I'll let Ben make a point that isn't completely necessary in a minute, and essentially just some engineering capacity to initially set this up. So you have to have somebody. It will take an engineer for the initial setup for a small amount of time, but as Ben said previously, once you get to actually running the tags in the container, you don't. At that point, it's the same old GTM.
Yeah, we have a cool little wizard in the GTM UI that actually allows you to deploy the server resources and do a free trial, more or less, without any technical knowledge, without leaving GTM at all, without going to GCP. And so you can start sending traffic, see what it's like, play around with it, and then easily upgrade to a production mode, which has redundant servers and things like that. So the overhead cost to at least explore it is none, which is pretty cool.
Awesome. And with that, I think we're at the end of it. We used up a little bit more time. So Chase is going to come in and yell at us in a second. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to submit them. I love it. If you can't tell, I really like this stuff. So I'd love answering it. And thank you all for joining and listening to us talk about this.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate the time.
Thank you so much, Ben and Tyler. And we highly appreciate the session. Super informative. We are going to move, actually right now, we're going to nix the final break that we had scheduled. And we are going to dive right into the closing remarks with InfoTrust Chief Growth Officer, Michael Lobin. Again, before we do that, I do want to mention in the YouTube live chat, there is a second form link. A number of you have already filled it out. Thank you very much. Please, if you have not filled it out, go ahead and do so quickly now. So that is going to do two things. It's going to, one, tell us your thoughts on the day. we certainly want feedback, and we'll be working to improve our next summit. We have a finance and a retail analytics summit coming up in the spring. Those are two different summits, so look out for those. But we want to take any feedback you have from this summit and apply it there. And of course, we'll be back with another CPG summit in fall 2022. So all your feedback is super helpful. Also, that is going to confirm to us that you have attended throughout the duration of today's summit, so you will be eligible for the Peloton drawing. So please do that quickly. And with that, I will turn it over to Michael Lobon.
Thank you, Chase. To summarize something like this is not a small feat. We spent the past 4 hours talking about digital analytics, experimentation, testing, certainly covered a lot of ground. And one of the things that I do when I attend very informative sessions, webinars, seminars, conferences is thinking ahead 6 months from now. Where do I want to be? How do I want to succeed in the current role or as part of the organization, as part of the company? And what are some of the learnings that would help me get there? Because certainly it's impossible to act on everything that was discussed today. And so using that frame of mind, let's maybe think about all of the sessions and topics that we covered today and see if we can pinpoint some of the themes and areas that stood out. Now, initially, when we started the session, we talked with Joanna. I think the pillar of everything that we've been discussing is it's consumer first. Whatever we do, whatever strategy we decide to focus on, it has to be consumer centric. And when we talk about CPG space, it's about, well, how do we collect first party data? And hey, if we're going to collect first party data, how do we do it in a very transparent fashion to make sure that consumers understand what we are collecting about them, how we are collecting the data about them, and what we are going to do with the data. And something that Joanna called out that's really important is the application of data, right? Before we even start collecting the information, we need to be very mindful about what are we going to do with that information, how it's going to be applied. Then we've talked about experimentation, and that's something that was called out by Joanna as well as by Kaysan later in sessions today, is when we talk about the work that needs to happen, well, instead of doing everything at once, let's figure out what are the small experiments that we can make and how can we really position ourselves to succeed. And we've talked about experimentation from the strategy standpoint. What are the strategic initiatives that we can play this experiment? We've talked about possibly bringing in new partners that we can experiment with, and certain experimentation with new tools. And later in discussion, we had presentations on J4 and just finished a presentation on server-side GTM with Tyler and Ben. And towards the end of Joanna's presentation, we also talked about what are some of the questions that we need to be considering as we are planning ahead. First of all, putting yourself in a customer, in a consumer's shoes, is this something that you would want a company to do to you as a consumer? What are some of the long-term metrics, and what is our long-term success? And is it really going to be sustainable? How do we continue to be outcome focused and continue to build on a success? So all of those things were discussed just in the first 45 minutes of today's summit. And then since first party data collection and being consumer centric is so important, we've talked or we've heard Shafi and Lucas talk about data governance and the importance of truly understanding consumer expectations and all of the changes that are happening right now in the industry, from regulatory changes by different governments around the world. And when you work for a multi-brand CPG organization, you certainly need to be mindful of all of the changes across the world as different brands, different websites are impacted by laws and regulations across different countries. We've talked about how consumer expectations are changing, and consumers are now a lot more mindful about the data that is being collected about them and how the data is going to be used. And certainly technology changes that are happening right now that we need to be mindful of. And Shafi called out the importance for transparency, the importance for data governance, data compliance, and establishing a global data structure. And talking about all of the changes that are happening, especially on regulatory side and the technology side, when we think about technology space and when we think about the tools that we have access to, is how do we have a durable technology stack? How do we build it to last? And today we've heard the presentation about the GA4 and how it is going to be the future of analytics. And we just had a great presentation on server-side GTM. And a couple of other things to call out that stood out to me from the discussion this Kei-san, and I've been fortunate to work and spend time with Kei-san over the past couple of years, and how insightful she is. Never seems to amaze me. Always seems to amaze me. And she talked about move slow to move fast, right? The tiny wins that we can make, and how do we learn and fail fast, right? And at the end of the day, if something is not working, there is no shame in saying this did not succeed, but this is what we've learned, and now we are going to direct our resources to something else. And when we talk about implementation, when we talk about build versus buy, well, what is that one differentiator that we are going to focus on, and how we are going to really build that in-house so we can control our roadmap? And look, we are going through interesting, challenging, unprecedented times. And sometimes what we are planning to do, sometimes the products that we are planning to send out tomorrow, or that need to be shipped in 1 week, or need to be delivered in 1 week, might not get there on time. So how do we over communicate with our consumers? And it's not just about shipping, but it is also about data collection. It's also about data application. And something that is really true when we think about putting consumer first. Well, if we are putting our customer, if we are putting consumer first, we need to over communicate with them so we have that transparency. And that's something that consumers will absolutely appreciate. And Kei-san ended the presentation on the importance of social impact and how important that is. So as I'm thinking through all of these sessions and the topics that were covered today, probably a couple of themes that come to mind that I drafted as I was preparing for the closing remarks, if you will. One is, we've talked about all of the changes. Well, the best thing about these changes that are happening right now is that these changes really unify all, and these changes happen to all organizations in the same fashion, right? So this is our opportunity within the new reality, within the privacy-centric world that we now live in, to innovate, right? So we have opportunity and responsibility for all of us. We need to develop culture of testing and easy wins, because as we've discussed, those easy wins are helpful in creating habits for our organization. And we have the responsibility to our organization as well as to our customers to be thinking long-term, as well as short-term, but never just short-term. And ultimately, let's focus on small motions, small wins, so we can get to our first headstand, so we can finish our first marathon, whether it's running or running a digital strategy in your organization. And considering that Adam Grant has been called out a couple of times by a number of speakers in today's presentation, I thought it would be only appropriate to finish this session with a quote from Adam Grant. It takes confident humility to admit that we are a work in progress. It shows that we care more about improving ourselves than proving ourselves. And I think when it comes to digital measurement and digital analytics, we are all work in progress. And good luck to all of us. Back to you, Chase.